The problem with looking at medieval art when we're talking about arms and armour is that a huge amount of it is complete and utter fantasy. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, any of you who've watched over the years my numerous videos about medieval, specifically medieval arms and armour, all the way back into the early medieval period, say Viking era, all the way up to the Renaissance, you will know that I use a lot of visual resources, both in referencing but also actually on screen. I show examples of arms and armour, and this is one of the main sources we've got for studying the development, the types, the usage of arms and armour in the medieval period are the artistic sources. But we have to take a lot of them with a massive pinch of salt, because a lot of them are complete fantasy. What do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, they're usually telling stories. So a huge percentage of the medieval art showing things like battles and sieges and just knights standing around in armour and this kind of stuff are portraying stories, just the same as modern superhero movies or comic books or anything else like that. They are portraying characters from stories. So very often they are Arthurian legends, or they're tales from the Bible, or they're Greek and Roman myths. So very often they are portraying people who are from stories who they have no personal connection at all to, and therefore the artist has a part to play in portraying, in many cases, a time long ago forgotten that might be in an exotic environment. So that means not only have we got a separation of time, we might be referring to a time of myth and legend, but we've also very often got a separation of geography. The artist is often trying to show somewhere far away. It might be in the Middle East, it might be in the Far East, it could be in Africa. It might be, basically it's not somewhere in Europe very often, or even if it is somewhere in Europe, it's separated by time, so it's Arthurian legend, it's supposed to be hundreds of years ago. Or, thirdly, they're portraying a character who has certain character traits. Now, anybody who's played role-playing games or, watched movies like the Lord of the Rings movies and stuff like that will know that when you come to design the costume and the weapons for a certain character, you don't just go, okay, well, what's typical for this time period? We'll slap them in that. No. Indeed, you often won't put a helmet on them. Very often they'll be wearing a crown in situations where a normal monarch wouldn't be wearing a crown, because you want to remind people that they are the monarch. Their sword will be a hero weapon. Conan the Barbarian doesn't have just any old sword. Red Sonja doesn't have just any old sword. They have a hero sword, even though in the books they don't. And very often they'll have supernatural and superhero type qualities. So they will use an especially large sword or weapon, or they'll have armour which is very distinctive and easy to notice on screen. And it's exactly the same in manuscripts. Did you know, for example, that when you're looking at medieval manuscripts, often you'll see a bunch of people in armour, and the armour will be different colours. Now that tells you an awful lot. So a lot of people have written books in recent years and had debates on the internet about the colours of original armours. Was it all bright, shiny, silver polished? Was lots of it blued? Was some of it hammer, straight from the forge, blackened? Was it gilded and this kind of stuff? And the problem with using artwork is very often the artwork, particularly if we're looking at battle scenes that are portraying historical, mythological, legendary, character-based stories, as they so often are with medieval art, there is a sort of artistic shorthand being used to portray what you see, I was going to say on screen, but in this case on the vellum or in the manuscript. And so one of these examples is the king will often have a crown on the helmet, which we know was something that did happen. There's in fact even written references to it. Henry V, for example, having part of the crown on his bassinet being struck off at the Battle of Agincourt. It did happen. But an artistic shorthand in medieval manuscripts is very often the king will be shown in gilded armour. That's how you can spot the king. Even in historical fencing treatises, we see this type of artistic kind of writing, I suppose, storytelling. In Fiore de Liberi's treatise, Flower of Battles, we actually see that the master, the person who's winning the technique, has a garter. Some of them have garters, some of them have crowns. And so this is, they weren't literally necessarily wearing garters and crowns, but it explicitly says in the book, this is how you know who's the person who is the master of that technique or who's winning this particular technique. So it's an artistic shorthand, a way of explaining something to the reader. And a reader can be a reader of words or a reader of images. And, you know, an image will tell 1,000 words. So when we're looking at these artworks, we have to bear all of this in mind when looking at the arms and armour. And about a week ago, I posted what I thought was a quite amusing, and it seems other people thought so as well, quite amusing picture that I found in a random treatise. I was looking for something else, of a guy who had I think he had 4 messers he was wearing. He had a whole bunch of throwing spears or javelins and a poleaxe. He was armed to the teeth and wearing really wacky armour. Now, you shouldn't, if you're a reenactor or doing living history or writing books or researching arms and armour, look at that image and go, well, there you go, in the year, whatever it was, 1480, this is how a person might have been equipped. No, there wasn't someone wandering around in that wacky, outrageous combination of arms and armour. The fact is that's part of a story, and that is a character. So you have to take it with a massive pinch of salt. But does that mean, therefore, that the medieval manuscripts are useless? Hell no, they're massively, massively useful. Because you have to remember that the artist is a product of their place and time. Case in point, when a 15th century artist wants to show Ottoman Turks, they generally equip them with falchions. Now, some of the falchions they show are weird and wacky, and they're not shapes that we think probably existed. But some of them definitely are. Some of them are just typical, pretty much, let's say, Italian storta, or sometimes German Langmesser, and sometimes other forms of, you know, French or English, Belgian, whatever, Flemish falchions. And the reason that they show them in the hands of the Ottoman Turks is by that point in the 15th century, the Ottoman Turks, while they were using some straight swords, they were, by this point, famously using early forms of the kilich, or pala, as it was later called. And this is a form of sword which is distinct, at least if used en masse, distinct from the swords which most of the Europeans they're fighting against were using. So therefore, when a European artist, let's say in Germany or Flanders, goes to represent, oh, here's a bunch of, European knights fighting against a bunch of Ottoman Turks, let's say at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1390s, when they come to show that in art, when they're making the art, let's say in the 1480s, they say, okay, we want the person to see that they're two different people. So they equip all of the Turks with turbans on their heads. They give them some wacky armour, which isn't necessarily based on any real Ottoman armour at all, and they equip them with falchions. Whereas the Europeans, they put them in knightly armour, all of them. There's no, you don't see loads of pikemen or halberdiers, billmen, or even lots of archers mostly, and sometimes the archers are in full harness, full plate harness. You just have a bunch of Europeans who are shown in high quality, high status plate armour, because you've got to remember who are these books being made for and who's paying for them, the people who are going to be wearing the rich plate armour. And they equip them predominantly, if not entirely, with straight double-edged swords, because this is the iconic and most widespread type of sword used in Europe. And this is how you visually show the two opposing forces. We even get similar things like this that happens in modern filmmaking, relatively modern filmmaking. It was even happening as early as World War I, where when they showed reconstructed scenes of fighting on the Western Front, in the trenches and raiding trenches and stuff like this, when they showed that sort of early footage, a lot of which was filmed just after World War I, but with soldiers who had actually served in World War I, they made sure that you always had Germans coming from one side and, British and French and Americans coming from the other side, so that the audience could always tell, oh, these are the good guys, those are the bad guys. We know because they always come from the left, they always come from the right. It's this same kind of artistic short, and of course you've got the different helmet styles as well in that case. But it's an artistic shorthand, and it's a way of communicating with the audience. So we have to bear that in mind. But it's not useless at all, because it does show us certain things. And one of those things with the falchion example, it shows us that there was an acknowledgement that the types of swords that the Ottoman Turks were using were, for the most part, if not entirely, for the most part, different to the types of sword that most of the Europeans that they were fighting against were using. And aside from that, the European artists are also very good at injecting things which are completely normal into their fantasy art. So even if they're showing a scene from the Tales of King Arthur or something out of the Old Testament, they often show what is actually quite normal European arms and armour. You will very often see, arming swords and longswords and poleaxes and glaives of a type that actually still exist in museums. We know that they existed. We can independently verify that they existed because you can see examples which look exactly the same from archaeology and surviving in armouries as on the manuscript page. And obviously that's the same with armour as well, whether it's bassinets, sallets, cuirasses or full armours. You can see that very often the artist has studied real arms and armour and is portraying them in their fantasy images. And on that tone, I actually find it most useful to look for the subtle details, because very often medieval artists will make the big noticeable things weird and wacky. So if you've got some biblical or mythological hero, they will give them a completely outrageous sword or spear or club or whatever. Like Hercules has always got the weird and wacky weapons and things like this. And very often certain heroes from myths and legends won't have any armour on, won't have any helmets on, just like in modern Hollywood basically, very similar in fact. But when you look at the little details, when you look at the rank and file soldiers, the people that the artist didn't care that much about, they often show them far more normal. If you look at the arms and equipment of them, if you look at the civilians, if you look at how the belts are buckled and sort of knotted around, if you look at how the purses are worn, if you look at the type of shoes being worn by different statuses of the people, these sort of subtle level details are often incredibly historically accurate for the time when the art was made. So very often it's the main front characters, the heroes, the Aragorns and the Boromirs, who are weird and wacky in their arms and armour, and the enemies, the Uruk-hai, who have the weird and wacky weapons and armour, they are noticeable and weird, and you have to sort of have a big, like I say, a pinch of salt and discount some of the weird and wacky things for those. But when you look at the background characters and when you look at the low level details, the things which an artist wouldn't bother to put effort into to change, like what does a castle wall look like, what does a gatehouse with the portcullis look like, these kind of things look incredibly historically accurate and incredibly normal. So there we go, I'm going to wrap it up there, but really just to say we have to be incredibly thoughtful and cautious when looking at medieval art for the study of arms and armour, and we have to, as much as possible, look at independent verification from archaeology, antique collecting and the surviving record of objects that we still have. Also, non-storytelling sources like fencing treatises, which often show arms and armour just in a literal sense being used. They've got no particular agenda to show weird and wacky stuff most of the time, unless it's Talhofer. Most treatises, something like Fiore, for example, just seems to be probably drawn from life, just showing real stuff. So there are other artistic sources that we can draw upon to kind of, sometimes you look at a manuscript, looking at the Siege of Troy, for example, a popular topic in medieval art, and you can see the weird and wacky stuff, and you can, if you know enough about arms and armour, you can separate the weird and wacky, and you can focus in on the pretty much mundane, normal and realistic stuff. So the more you learn, the more useful it is. Take a big pinch of salt with these sort of fantasy or biblical or kind of storytelling sources, but they are still useful, and these are still an amazing corpus of material. So when I use them on this channel, and I have been questioned on this actually in the past when I have used some of these images, when I use them on this channel, I tend to pick out things to illustrate the point I'm making. Maybe at some point in the future, if there's an appetite for it, I might do a video just looking at some of the weird and wacky stuff and why I consider it to be weird and wacky, because there are certainly hundreds, probably thousands of manuscript images like people jousting on giant snails, which clearly are fantasy, but there's even some more subtle stuff which I consider fantasy, which some people out there might assume that, I have to say with falchions are a good example. Some people have done reproductions of falchions from manuscripts where I'm like, well, they're representing a very particular group of foreign people a long time ago, far, far away in a galaxy far, far away, and they're showing weird and wacky weapons. We don't actually know that those falchions ever existed, because I think they've kind of tweaked them to make them look more exotic. So maybe we could do a video about that in the future. But really, this is, I suppose, an introduction to the topic, just to say medieval art sources, fantastic. You have to take them with caution, but people who study these sources all the time generally can fairly easily separate what is definitely realistic, what's definitely fantasy, and actually what's kind of ambiguous in the middle is relatively minimal in percentage. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting and useful, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks!